Welcome to the Rise to Thrive podcast. Rise to Thrive is your real talk resource to elevate your life and business through growth, wellness, and manifestation. With your co-host, Linda Tate, financial advisor turned life and wealth strategist, founder of Leela Life, and self-named Nordic shaman, and Amelia Travis, yoga teacher turned multi-six-figure business coach, founder of Stoked Yogi, and spiritual warrior. We're here to help you level up and create the life you imagine, sharing inspiration and strategy to elevate vibes and consciousness so you can rise to your best self and thrive as your best self. Tune in weekly to Thrive Daily. Tuning in now.
That is part of why I love psilocybin for therapeutic modalities.
Oh, can we talk about this?
Well, this is the perfect intro to the show. Episode 31, Rise to Thrive podcast. Irene Morning, complex trauma. Welcome back, you guys, to Rise to Thrive. We're so stoked to have you here and so excited to share today's guest with you. We are interviewing Irene Bright Drum, better known as Irene Morning, an expert on complex trauma, yoga therapist. She hails from the East Coast, and she's about to blow your freaking fracking minds, you guys, about what is trauma and how does it show up in our lives. Welcome to the show, Irene.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the show, Linda.
Well, thank you. It's great to be back.
Irene, tell us about yourself. Who are you? What's your story?
Well, Amelia, my story is I am currently a yoga therapist based in Providence, Rhode Island. But I'm a lifelong yoga practitioner and student. And
Lifelong?
Well, basically,
She was practicing in the womb.
I started at 12. Is that young enough?
That's pretty young. Yeah.
I hated it when I was 12.
Tell me about your first yoga class.
Well, so I grew up doing ballet pretty seriously, and the company that I was in middle school had us do yoga and Pilates as like supplemental strength and flexibility stuff. But like being a 12-year-old in the ballet world, I was like, this sucks. Like, what do you mean I'm not supposed to be competitive right now? I want my leg higher than hers.
Oh, so yoga was trying to talk to you about ego eradication, and you were just like, I'm a prima ballerina. Get that out of my face with all that noise.
Kind of.
Okay.
But that was before I went through all my own trauma. Well, maybe not totally before, but in the midst of it, and like definitely was not using yoga for my own trauma work at that point. And I kind of got more and more into it like around college. And actually kind of sank deeper into understanding that yoga really had something deeper to offer me when I came to it in the midst of like a really painful heartbreak and a whole bunch of disordered eating and a lot of, well, I don't want to say weird addictive behavior because all addictive behavior actually makes sense, but like some slightly unusual manifestations of addictive behavior, and was using yoga to control my body. Like I wasn't connecting with other forms of exercise, or I like really hated other forms of exercise and was feeling like yoga's a way for me to keep myself skinnier. Yoga's a way for me to more easily manage my appetite when I don't want to eat anything. Yoga is going to help me like sculpt myself in a certain kind of way where like maybe I'm going to get this guy back who I was like devastated over.
Isn't that so funny? I remember very consciously, I started yoga at 16, and such a similar story, Irene. I never even knew this about you. Like I started yoga because I wanted to be skinny. I thought yoga was going to make me skinny.
Yeah.
And, skinny and flexible and look like a fitness model. And then I got there and there's this lady in this yellow shirt and white pants with the chanting and the incense. And I was like, what the hell is this? What did I sign up for? But, at the end of that, it was a 2.5-hour class at a local community college. And at the end of the first class, it was, I think,
a long first class.
Yeah, it was because it was like a 1-credit class, but it was only 9 weeks. So anyway, there was two nights a week and it was 2.5 hours. So she, in order to fill that time, she was a Shivananda yogi. So she did the whole shebang. I mean, we had, a philosophy talk, and then we had asana, and then we had pranayama, and then we had meditation, and all of those, it was like legit hatha yoga where like each posture was, you know,
5 minutes.
what most people would consider like a yin length. Like it was like, yeah, we're here for, you know, a solid minimum 16 to 20 breaths.
I love that as an exposure to yoga, because that like actually encompasses everything. Like the way that
like
we're doing
yoga
videos now is like so sectioned off and like not.
Yeah, but I was pissed. I was like, what is all this garbage? Like,
where's the weight loss?
where's the Lululemon? Like, I just want my butt to look good in these leggings. You know what I mean? But
like, I just want to be cute in my yoga pants, damn it.
totally. I was a cheerleader at the time. Well, actually, I think I'd been kicked off of the squad for smoking weed, but I used to be a cheerleader and I wanted to be skinny. So I'm curious, because I feel like what we just heard was the beginning of your like rise to thrive story. So we kind of like to ask people about this concept of rise to thrive. What have you overcome in life, or what do you feel like, you know, what did you say this morning, Linda, with the Drake song?
We started from the bottom, now we're here.
Okay, so could you tell us about that? How does yoga tie into your rise to thrive story?
Well, yoga ties into that, because like that whole period that I was talking about, and actually coming to recognize that yoga had something more for me from that like really painful place, goes back to actually my mother got sick when I was 9 and went through this whole big dramatic illness experience with lung cancer, had her left lung removed, was cancer free for 4 years, and then it came back in her other lung. In between those 2 bouts of illness, my family went through a lawsuit because it was asbestos related. So there was this whole period of my 6th grade year where we were like back and forth, or no, we were mostly based in Texas when I'm actually from Massachusetts, to like relive all the trauma of her first illness.
Wow.
And then the cancer came back when I was going into 9th grade, and they did all the chemo that they could, to the point that it made her like so sick that she couldn't handle anymore. And then she died in October of my 9th grade year. So then my whole high school experience was me navigating life as a teenage girl who had already spent half her life dealing with a sick mom, and then no mom to help me navigate a home life that was only with men, my dad and brother. So some of what I started unpacking when yoga started opening up for me, like more meditative spaces, was a lot of the I'd been processing a lot of grief, but it opened up a lot of the unprocessed grief. And it started showing me like all of these kind of nooks and crannies of myself that were really related to that trauma experience and that loss experience as like really integral parts of myself.
When you say open up, do you mean physically, like experiencing the pain through your body, or what you're feeling emotionally, or both?
I mean, both, right? Because part of what I've now come to understand in yoga is like there's all these layers of ourselves, like all these layers of me as an individual being that are intertwined at every single moment. And at every single moment, there's a very particular imprint of like what that entwinement is. And what I think yoga does a really amazing job at is showing you what that entanglement is. So I started having experiences in my body that tapped me into headspaces that were totally new. And the point at which I decided to become trained, I wasn't intending to teach, but I wanted to go deeper into, oh my God, I actually reached a point of clarity and a point of calm in my racing thoughts.
When you said a few minutes ago that yoga does an amazing job of showing you what that entanglement is, and you also mentioned how for you, yoga was one of the things that helped reveal to you unprocessed grief. Mm-hmm. In those revelations, was it yoga bringing you to a place of emotional release? Or what was it that was happening in yoga that made you notice that you had unprocessed grief?
I think it was allowing myself, I'm really, really grateful to have had in my like earlier phases with yoga and tapping into it, teachers that were very, very, very much about like, these are all just suggestions and make your time in the practice your own, which is something that I now say to my students all the time, because what it did for me in my practice was allowed me, I had full permission to like, when a strong emotion came up in a pose, just drop to child's pose and let myself cry it out.
Yeah.
And like that would happen all the time.
That's so powerful. Whoa.
There also was a thing for me. I think like I actually have a very clear memory of being in a vinyasa class and like being at the beginning of a sun salutation, reaching my arms up over my head into a back bend and feeling this clarity run through me that was like, stick with this. There's more to look at. And like going home from that and starting to really think about, okay, if I want to go deeper into this, what does that look like? Should I maybe pursue a teacher training?
This reminds me of how often, and I relate to your story, I was a dancer for a while and then went into swimming and then found yoga to be a better swimmer. And for my, I'm 16 at the time. I was going late to high school to go to yoga before the internet worked and renegade yogi. But, you're coming to it for all of like the physical, right? And it's like so ego driven. And then I think people have their own experience on their own timeline of how it, like you said, gets to these deeper and deeper layers. And, so powerful of like what information comes up for you during that. And then to see what you're doing now with the work, helping others with their trauma. It's really powerful.
Yeah. I think the other thing that like helped me see beyond that ego-driven body-based place was that I wound up in India for my first 200-hour training, and I was
for your first 200 hours. Our faces right now, because my eyes are bugging out of my head, and then just started cracking up. Like, by the way, welcome. Your highest self, when it told you like there's more to see here, like it was not fucking around. It was like, we're just gonna go right into it.
You're just gonna go right into it. And I can also like get into some of how that actually came a little bit from somewhat of a trauma-driven place in my nervous system of like really seeking like full stimulation. But I also have this very tangible memory of being in teacher training, studying primarily with Indian men, and one of them saying, if you want to study the body-based stuff, if you want to study asana really in depth and you're curious about how the physical body works, you should be in Canada or the US. But you're not, you're in India. So like come along with the ride for all the philosophy stuff.
Yeah.
He was like, Canada and the US have gotten really, really, really good at figuring out like the biomechanics and the physical body. And if you really want to know musculoskeletal systems, go back to the West. But like, we're here talking about the healing systems and the energy body and like what's happening to you in meditation.
How did that land with you at that time?
I was really resistant to the meditation piece, but I was finding myself holding physical postures for like 5 minutes and totally spacing out and not calling that meditation.
Do you feel like well, we're going to get into this conversation about trauma and embodiment, right? But do you feel like for you, when you say you were really bad at meditation, that it was more available to you in movement or in that physical stimulation because you perceived yourself to be doing something, right? So then your mind could actually relax. Whereas when we try to sometimes sit and our perception is, oh, I'm not doing anything, then the mind starts to go bananas, right? Or if we can distract the mind with like, oh, my quads are working and I'm, whatever posture you're holding, you're in chair pose or something.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've also since come to understand a lot better about having any kind of trauma history is that sometimes it's really, really, really helpful for your brain and its connection to your body to actually be stimulated by movement so that it has sensation that it can pay attention to. It's kind of like, if your energy is vibrating on a 9 and you try to just suddenly grab it out of the air and bring it down to a 1, it's going to resist you. Sometimes you need to meet it up there at a 7 or an 8 to actually make the 9 within reach to slowly bring it down. Does that make sense?
Totally. I mean, if like in layman's terms, it's like if you're feeling really stressed out, go have sex or go for a run or go kickboxing, like that will help you. I mean, it'll obviously help you in the fact that like, producing endorphins and like really like equalizing the nervous system overall. But what I'm hearing you say is just also that like, on the mental level to give you gotta
meet yourself where you're at.
It's like you just don't turn the Vitamix off.
Yeah.
By the way, I never knew that.
Turn it down. Turn it down.
I broke my freaking Vitamix.
But the thing that I'll also say about that is like when we're talking about actually healing the underlying traumas, and we will talk a little bit more about like specifically what I mean by underlying traumas, but when we're talking about healing and not just managing, right? Those are all management and coping mechanisms, going for a run, having sex. Meeting the energy where it's at is a coping mechanism. What we ultimately want to do is give you the capacity to actually bring it the whole way down so that you have a spectrum that you're experiencing between stress and relaxation, not just like different ways of experiencing heightened energy.
That's good. That's good shit, Irene.
That's so clear.
Whoa.
Yeah, I mean, because I think you see so much where, I hear this a lot where it's like, yeah, I work out for my meditation. And it's like, that to me is exactly what you're saying. Like it's the coping skills, which are amazing and probably a lot healthier.
So important.
Yeah, than a lot of. And then the next step of the journey gets deeper and deeper. That is truly like the healing. And I think there's a certain point where you look at yourself and say, oh, this isn't healing. This was the coping. Like, the over-exercise isn't the healthy me, isn't the healing. That was, a substitute or a replacement. And like I said, a lot healthier than some others.
Totally. And that's the thing. I mean, like especially in the addiction work that I've done, like when we're talking about using a substance for self-soothing, it's like, okay, you learned to do that because it worked for you. Like you learned to do that because it serves a purpose. So
it was survival.
It was survival and it was soothing and it helped you on a very intuitive level balance something out that was out of balance. What we need to do to ultimately move toward healing and not just managing is to figure out what you can do on your own without that substance when that coping mechanism is no longer serving you because it also has detrimental effects in your life. And that's the thing for me about like talking about complex trauma is the coping mechanisms that we develop around it are so important and so useful. And they really do serve us, but there comes a point where they also have detrimental impacts.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit for everybody who's listening who maybe has a definition of trauma that could possibly differ from what we're talking about here. Can you share with us how you define trauma, complex trauma? What do those terms mean?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, and you guys obviously feel free to chime in, but like in my experience, when I initially say trauma, people think I'm talking about like a major injury or an assault or an event that happened, like, or, they think about PTSD and soldiers coming back from war, having seen like really horrific things.
Yeah. I think like shark bite.
Yeah.
Like shark bite or violent rape or something. Like, I think it was a singular event or an event that was recurring, but this thing happened and it was traumatic, right? The trauma was something that was done to you or perpetrated against you, right?
Like CSI style.
Yeah. What I'm talking about is anything that you learned to protect yourself against. So for most of us, I think it's actually, I have this right in front of me. The National Center for Mental Health Promotion and Youth Violence Prevention in 2012, so very early on in the complex trauma conversation, said that 60% of American adults report experiencing abuse or difficult family circumstances during childhood.
60%.
60%.
Yeah. So if you're listening, you can, I mean, and that's people who reported it.
And that's people who reported it. And there's other numbers that are reported as way higher. And to me, like, what's significant about that is just like the concept of difficult family circumstances. Who hasn't had difficult family circumstances? If you have difficult family circumstances at any point in your developmental years, you have learned some kind of behavioral coping mechanism.
Absolutely.
So what I hear also is like everybody has experienced trauma.
Yeah. And I want to be careful about getting into, like, I believe that, yes. And I also want to be very careful to acknowledge, like, there are different kinds of trauma and there's a huge spectrum of trauma, and like race-based trauma is a completely different trauma than like what I went through in my family-based trauma. And there's different scopes of how much we internalize it and how perpetuated it is by the circumstances of your life.
Well, you could say even, right, like cultural trauma or some kind of like sexism trauma. I mean, that these are undercurrents of centuries of suffering that are like a collective traumatic experience.
Totally. And so for me, there's also this piece where like it's very tied to the power dynamics of our politics and our culture. And most of my work is with women, and there usually comes a point where they recognize they're in some kind of pattern that they learned from their mother having some kind of trauma.
Yes.
So there is this like intergenerational gender-based thing going on too.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's really interesting to have this conversation because, Irene, before I knew you, I was fully in the camp of trauma as event with pain attached. And what I later realized after our conversation is that in so many different ways, when you say anything that you learned to protect yourself against, some of the ways that you might have done that were learning to make yourself small or quiet, learning to not speak because when you spoke, it incited violence or anger in your home. You know, we talked about a little bit about people pleasing and perfectionism and attention deficit disorder and
social anxiety. Social anxiety is like one of the big ones that I kind of like to harp on these days because everyone that I talk to seems to have it in some way, shape, or form. And to me, that comes from like, if you've ever in your life experienced someone else as unsafe, then when you're stepping into kind of uncertain social situations, your nervous system is kind of like scanning to figure out how safe it can become.
And do you think that that's like enhanced or like exacerbated by an increasingly digitally connected culture and like increasingly disconnected on the analog level of like having face-to-face conversation with people?
In part, yeah, because so one of the like thinker scientist people that really
that's the technical term.
Yeah, the technical term. The guy that I really like, who I saw him speak in January, and he was talking about like what it does to the development of our nervous systems. And when I'm talking about your nervous system, I mean your brain, and I mean then all the nerves stemming down from your brain that go out into your body. There's a big chunk of your nervous system that is about connection with other people. And what it does for you And this is why pranayama is so important, is because it's like the easiest doorway into regulating this part of your nervous system. What this like social connection part of your nervous system does is it reads facial cues, it reads voice tone, it reads voice inflection, it reads eye contact. It's like all of these ways that we communicate with other people. And when we're doing all of this stuff that's based on our phones, most of us typically are in a position where that part of our nervous system is actually kind of shut down because we're like rounding forward and our head goes down. Mm-hmm. And since we're spending all this time in like these mostly screen spaces, we're not necessarily getting the same eye contact and facial connection and all of those cues that that part of your nervous system is looking for.
Wow, that's pretty cool. And is that because pranayama tones the vagus nerve? Is that kind of what you're talking about? Okay.
Yeah.
The vagus nerve is where it's all at.
Dude.
The vagus nerve is where it's all at. The vagus nerve like runs everything.
So cool. The vagus, for those of you interested, comes from the Latin for wandering. And you can tone the vagus nerve through pranayama and also through singing, through kirtan, and through cold showers, which is like cold stimulates the vagus nerve, right? Which is why like washing your face with cold water or doing Wim Hof method of like the ice baths or the cold showers is supposed to be quite beneficial for the parasympathetic nervous system.
But also interoception, right? Which is your ability to feel your own body and feel your own states in your own body lead to vagal tone.
Oh, that's interesting.
Which is also part of why
what is
yoga
the word again? Interoception? Not proprioception.
Not proprioception. Proprioception is your ability to feel where you are in space, but interoception is your ability to feel how you are.
Whoa, that's cool. It's a cool word.
Cool, right?
People, how you are in your body, you know, once again, kind of going back to athletics, like I remember getting more into yoga as young 20s and starting to be in my body. And I'm like, oh, damn, if I could have just had this experience, you know, a decade ago. I never had really that experience of being fully in my body. And I think that's just such an ongoing practice. And when I think of like the distractions of phone and media, these to me take you so out of that experience.
Yeah. So one of the big things that I talk to people about is like, are you noticing that you're numbing out? That could be an expression of some deeper underlying trauma.
Well, I think that's, so this word interoception and the ability to feel how you are, I think the buzzword that we most correlate with that is embodiment, right? And we talk a lot about embodiment, especially if you are in the yoga culture or even just women's empowerment. One of the things that we're often working with women on is embodiment. What is your actual connection to, as you put it, how you are in your body, or even whether or not you're in your body? So what I'm hearing you say is this question of are you noticing that you're numbing out could also be expressed as do you feel disconnected from your body to the point that you seek out intense stimulation in some way?
Totally. And that's something that comes up in what I do all the time, is like one of the protective mechanisms that we develop is to disconnect from our feeling, because we're designed to protect ourselves from pain, right? So at the threat of pain, we have all these complex mechanisms to disconnect from it a little bit. And so part of what then we're doing when we're not coming from a healed place, part of what we're seeking is really intense sensation, because if it's not intense, we're not necessarily going to feel it because we've gotten into that protective mechanism. So like for a long time, and this is like when you have some kind of trauma, you will, like in combination with that, keep repeating what that feeling is, just because it's the framework that you have for feeling. So my primary emotional framework from that trauma with my mother's death was grief. So for most of my teenage years and 20s, when I felt I was perpetuating a state of grief because it was all I knew how to feel. Like if I got to a place of calm in my life, I was like, well, this can't be right.
This is
You know what I
what
mean?
Tony Robbins explains as your emotional home. And
Right.
it's like, you know, you're just looking for ways to get back there. And at whatever point you can realize like, oh, that served me for exactly what trauma I went through, but is it time to rent or buy a new emotional home?
Totally.
I'm finding myself in your words and following a train of thought that leads me from like through my addiction and how as a deeply feeling person,
Oh, I just got chills when you said that.
as a deeply feeling person who experienced a significant emotional pain at the threshold of young adulthood, right? My dad cheated on my mom and left when I was 13, and I had then this father wound that I didn't know necessarily how to process, and so my way was just to shut that down. And what I've continued to seek out over the years is, you know, sometimes I like to frame my drug use as like consciousness exploration, and perhaps at times it has been, but I think on the greater whole, it's been seeking out the stimulation or the sensation of like, I don't know. That's what I'm like. I'm trying to figure out, yeah, feeling, but I'm trying to figure out as I say that, it's like, okay, painkillers and cocaine, it's been different things, but it's like enhancing or like like making it heightened somehow so that I can maybe feel.
Well, it kind of goes both ways. There's like a numbing mechanism and a heightening mechanism. And the thing for me about trauma is that it just kind of like dysregulates everything. So when you're then using those things outside of yourself, you can be looking for both at the same time.
Yeah.
You
yeah,
can be.
It's just an interesting train of thought. And this is what I feel like I keep realizing deeper and deeper the more I learn from you and talk with you, Irene, is that it's not even necessarily about going back and mining, because my brain keeps wanting to go and mine my past for the original incident, right? I'm like, where did the trauma come from? And like, this is the whole conversation that we're having is you are carrying not just event-based trauma, which is, you know, these emotions that you had that then are stored in the body, but you are also carrying this complex trauma of anything that you learn to protect yourself against, and existing within a framework of generational and intergenerational trauma, which is, like Linda said, what we carry as the collective. So I think it's kind of, even like, I appreciate what you're saying about there being a scope and a scale of different types of trauma, and by no means are we trying to throw a blanket statement out here saying, yep, everybody's got it, so therefore yours,
it's all the same,
right? Like, that's not what we're saying. But I do think it's interesting to explore the fact that perhaps most of us have the opportunity to do work around uncovering the things that we learned to protect ourselves against, so that we can integrate these layers of being and exist in a state of more clarity, more self-awareness, and really more peace, so that we can have more peace.
Equanimity is the word that I keep coming back to with this stuff, is like, you know, if you look at the patterns that you've developed and the behaviors that you develop to protect yourself, they usually are in those major fluctuations because you're used to needing that kind of stimulation or that kind of numbing. And
creating fights in your relationships.
Like, totally. Or, I mean, even if you're not creating a fight, I've also been finding myself in these conversations with a lot of women clients and women friends lately, where they come up into a conflict in their relationship, and all they want to do in the conversation that we're having is psychoanalyze their partner. And when you ask them, well, where are you in this? What are your needs? How are you feeling? Many of them don't know how to answer the question.
That to me gets back to like the feeling that they are so disconnected from and have suppressed. Like, it had to be about them. It had to be about external, because that's been the distraction. That's been the coping mechanism the whole time.
Right.
And it's like that, no, you know, coming back to some kind of center. But maybe there's never been a center to come back to. And that's
exactly
like the starting point.
I feel like that resonates with a lot of your story, Linda, that you've shared in past episodes about reaching a point at some point in your 20s where you realized you had never really allowed yourself to feel things, and like going through this process of learning to feel.
When I can remember there was like a day, and it was within the decade, that the word trauma, I had always thought of trauma as really scary and like almost bad and shameful. And if someone would say, have you ever had a traumatic experience? I would say like, no. And yet if I would talk about some of my life experiences, you not being connected to me would be like, that's really traumatic. And I realized at one point, I'm like, trauma, there's the spectrum to trauma. And, it could be so simple as a physical small injury to the most horrific things. And I started looking back in my life, and I think of it as like a low-grade fever. There could be things like a low-grade fever that was going on for a decade that I didn't even know about, and just starting to kind of unpack that. So it definitely resonates, and it's like there's all different shapes and sizes of trauma, and each one to kind of be dealt with appropriately. And just when you sort of sorted through one kind, something else pops up, and it's a pretty interesting.
Well, totally. And that understanding of trauma, like what you just hit on, of that, there are as many shapes and sizes to it as there are human beings to experience it, right? And figuring out the tools for managing your own particular trauma really has to be a process in which you're cultivating your relationship with your intuition and your body and yourself, which, yoga is a wonderful, wonderful system for supporting us in. And also one of the things that I run into so much being in the wellness world is talking to people about, like, they have all these markers of things that I talk about with trauma, of like imposter syndrome and social anxiety and self-medicating and numbing and negative self-talk and racing thoughts and like all of these, and ADD and all these things that they don't necessarily, they recognize that they have some kind of trauma to work on, but they're also like, listen, I'm certified in all these different health modalities, and I am a 500-hour ERYT, and I'm teaching yoga all the time.
Stop talking about me, Irene. I'm right here.
And like they locate themselves in these systems that are great systems, but maybe they haven't exactly been given a framework for understanding like how it needs to be tailored to them individually to get at the heart of what's in there.
Or even like the opt-out, like I've learned all that already, like I'm good.
Yeah, well, exactly. Like I had a conversation with a yoga teacher the other day where she was like, I don't know, I know all this stuff.
Well, this is what I think is really interesting. And I think it goes back to us redefining, it goes back to exactly what you said about your time in India. It goes back to us redefining yoga and taking it from the colloquial yoga in the West, which is asana. It's postures with your body and
it's
breath,
exercise.
right? It's exercise.
Yeah, why don't we call it asana?
Taking it back to yoga as a system of self-inquiry, right? And as this holistic system of really asking the question, who am I, at every level that you can ask that. And that's a big question. That's like the question of like
and also framing
existence.
Yoga as a system of moving towards spiritual liberation. To move towards spiritual liberation, you have to be looking at how am I liberating or not liberating myself. And if I'm hanging on to these systems that are manifesting in withholding ways in my life, if I'm holding on to holding myself back, am I moving toward liberation? Not really.
Like the control and discipline.
Yeah.
I'm just stuck on holding myself back.
Good.
So good. Okay.
So what do we do? So we're experiencing.
What do we do, Irene?
Now what? Help me. I realized I've had low-level fever of trauma my whole life, and then some big incidences. What do I do now?
Well, you take an aspirin and you call it a day.
Oh, good. All right. We're all going to be okay.
First of all, like I said, breath is amazing. And also, before we started actually recording this episode, we were talking about orgasms being wonderful.
Yeah, man.
So their breathing gives you access to coming back to regulating your nervous system. Slowly, with breath and meditation, you can start to reprogram or rewire the ways that you've wired yourself to be in a constant state of protection. And like we kind of touched on before, like if you can't sit right down into breathwork and meditation, like when I teach vinyasa, I teach really, really, really slowly. If you need physical movement in order to access this stuff, see if you can get yourself into a physical movement pattern that's like inquiring how slowly you can move. Mm. And then the thing that we were saying about orgasms is like cultivating a sense of enjoyment and a sense of pleasure in your life.
Bingo.
To start to help you balance out that framework of repeating pain.
I think it's important to create a little clarification here, because our perception of orgasm in Western culture is very often based on the male arousal trajectory.
Yeah.
Harder, better, faster, stronger, like Kanye says. But for real, like that, especially when as in the feminine, when we come into that arousal trajectory, what we may be experiencing is not necessarily like it's maybe putting your pinky toe in the pool of what your orgasm could be and really is designed to be when you're operating in your full ability, right? So what I mean by this, you guys, is just the extension of pleasure as a practice can be really beneficial here. So rather than thinking about the orgasm as the goal, where it's like, we just got to get there. So let's we know ABC, rub this, do that, and we're going to be there in 5 minutes. Could you perhaps take, and we've talked about this before, could you take 20 minutes and literally, if you need to, put a timer on and practice self-touch, conscious self-touch, or conscious touch with your partner, where you're actually tuning into, what does this sensation feel like in my body? Where does it feel really good? Where are the erogenous zones that I didn't anticipate, and allowing that awareness to expand as a form of meditation, or a form of self-awareness, or it's a form of
interoception. It's
interoception. Yes, it's how you are. So I think that's important, especially for those of us who are like, oh, great, they're saying orgasm, cool, let me grab my rabbit, I'm gonna put it on speed 7, gonna go, and it's like, that's great. It out. That's great. You know what I mean? By all means do that, and you will feel better. You know what I mean? Go do it right now. Press pause, or just take this with you.
But you're touching on something that's really, really, really important to me about how we heal trauma is slowing down, figuring out how to slow down. And that can feel so fucking hard.
I was going to say agony.
Nothing in our lives is telling us to slow down. Nothing is structured for us to move more slowly.
I was away just recently, and I went to a tantric moon hatha class in Bali.
Sounds amazing.
I had I got advice from this Ayurvedic practitioner that I am like the sun. And do you know what that means? I'm too hot between 1 and 3. And he said, Linda, be more like the moon.
Siesta.
He said, be more like the moon. The moon is something that's comfortable all the time. And as much as it was hard to hear, I could hear it. And I think there's parts of me that I like being like the sun. So I find this moon hatha class, and it is so slow. And she was having us do some locks and some breathing locks. And I started feeling my throat close up because I was so uncomfortable going so slow, moving and breathing. And by the end of this 90-minute class felt so amazing, but it was every single bit of the intention of the class was to just go so slow And it is hard sometimes for sons to do that.
Totally. Well, and you're hitting on, like, sometimes when we have really acutely programmed trauma in the body, and like this also feels important for me to like throw in here when I'm harping on the breath, is like sometimes physiologically it will shut down your breathing mechanism. So
Well,
sometimes
for me in the class, like the whole experience, I'm like, I'm adding so much more fire to my day, going to like a vinyasa, moving fast, and it showed me like how much the contrast was necessary to just allow some of this to process. And to think that that's going to happen in a sweaty ass vinyasa class, it's not, it's almost.
Well, and isn't that such a funny thing how like hot vinyasa yoga has become like what Americans do? Like in our yoga culture, I feel like hot yoga, and like I like a hot yoga class from time to time. I used to teach a lot of hot yoga, but like it's interesting to me that we're attracted to that drive. And to go like way back to the beginning of our conversation, like that's a management mechanism for most of us, not diving into the slowing down for the deeper healing and the balancing out of your nervous system.
Well, and it's funny because it also speaks to and echoes so many of the things we're saying about politics, power dynamics, like what the masculine, linear, aggressive A to B kind of value system that's productivity based. It's like, yes, this is what we're culturally obsessed with, is harder, better, faster, stronger. Like that's what we want. You know what I mean? That's what we're taught to want. And I think it's unlearning that. That so many of us are so starved for. And so we start to get a taste of it if we're blessed enough to have that, and then like, this is where the inquiry really comes in, and we're like, ooh, how good can we take it? How deep can we go into this slowing down? And I think you're giving us so much, I can speak for myself, and I think Linda too, so much confirmation and remembrance of the fact that like, this is where you say healing is a way of being. It's like, where could you slow down each day if that's where you needed to start? Like, could you even slow down for 5 minutes? Like, and hearing Linda say, but you just spoke to about in her recent experience of trying to slow down, she actually experienced a little bit of that physiological mechanism of the breath stopping because it is so threatening in a way to get to that space of slowness.
Like she's asking me to breathe and move slow. Why can't I do this?
But all laughs aside, Irene, I think what you're saying is too, for some people with very acute trauma, like if you find yourself going into a panic attack and like actually feeling truly like you cannot breathe, like that can be happening, that is happening on a physiological level. So to give some respect to that and to understand like sometimes we can't.
Sometimes we can't. And that's why I like fully hold space for honoring the management mechanisms. And I say they're just as important as the healing, if not more, because it's kind of like, in harm reduction of like, you have to support someone to just even recognize that there's a problem before they get to shift into like healing it.
Well, so we ended up with, we've got breath, we've got orgasm, and then we kind of had the blanket statement of like how we heal trauma is slowing down.
Yeah.
What do you think we're giving people some tangibles? What do you think are some other things they can, because they want to do stuff. They don't want to just slow down and not do stuff. So what's the stuff we can do?
One of the things that I use the most with my clients is journaling sprints.
Ooh.
And
journaling sprints?
Yeah. So
sprinting in my journal? Explain.
I'm having you sprint in your journal, which, goes exactly counter to what we just said about slowing down. But
got my best pen and a stopwatch. Let's go.
But it's helpful for exactly that reason, because part of what and Amelia, I remember you posting about this at some point, like, I don't know, maybe months ago, about how like when you recognize that you are having like really racing thoughts and acute anxiety, of like sitting down and holding space for your mind to just like wear itself out.
The brain dump.
The brain dump. And what I've been finding really useful is like where we identify an area of self-sabotage or limiting behavior or discomfort in our lives, whatever that area is that you identify as like the one that you want to look at first, set a timer for, you can do it as short as 5 minutes, but something closer to 10 minutes I find more useful. Where, well, let me give you like a really specific. I was working with a client the other day where like her area for this was work. As she was saying, like, I'm getting in a people-pleasing dynamic with my boss, and I'm recognizing that my needs aren't getting met, and I don't know how to use my voice. And by the end of my day, I'm totally depleted. And so we decided that at the end of her work day, when she's like cleaning up her desk area and getting ready to leave, and she's kind of not doing like, you know, work in that last chunk of the day anyway, she's going to set 5 minutes to do a journaling sprint that looks at exactly those mechanisms. And she doesn't stop moving her pen the whole time that timer is going. And it's a total brain dump with the prompt of like, what were those people-pleasing behaviors and how did they impact me and what do I need before she leaves work for the end of the day. And you can apply that to your personal relationships. You can apply that to friendships. You can apply that to eating habits. You can apply that to work habits. But it starts to create a little bit of external accountability with yourself in looking at how are these behaviors showing up in my life.
I found that sometimes when I do this, and I journal pretty much every night. It is a practice that I try to keep every single night. Sometimes I skip it. But a really interesting thing happens is that sometimes as I'm writing the message, it starts to come from a place that's beyond me, or maybe it's from really within me, but I'll channel messages for myself that are really true, that definitely weren't operating in my conscious mind at all. And sometimes I read back through my journal and I'm just really surprised at how much we actually know about ourselves and what we need, but it's not at the forefront of our awareness.
Totally.
So I'm hearing like a subconscious accessing technique is basically what these journaling sprints might be.
Totally.
So breath, orgasm, journaling sprints, slowing down. Like, do you feel like the practice of mindfulness in general is beneficial, or like, you know, just slowing down when you're eating or slowing down when you're about to have that argument? Do you feel like or is that still trying? Is that still just grasping?
Well, I think the mindfulness practices are really, really, really super useful, as long as they're not creating shame and pressure for you. Because that's one of the big things that can come up, right? Is like when we feel like we're not healing properly, whatever that means, there can be a lot of shame associated with it. And mindfulness practices can be really hard to access if we're stuck in that like go mode at a 9, you know?
So do you mean because we'll be like, oh shit, I'm supposed to be being mindful and here I am like wolfing my food again? Or like where does this shame come in around mindful? And here's like a little caveat. I know I've got all the hours of yoga teaching you guys, but and maybe this is me expressing that shame right now. I was gonna say my mindfulness isn't very good. I'm not very good at it.
Well, it's exactly that thing where people are like, oh, I'm not good at meditating. My mind is too busy.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's like, no, we don't actually care if you like actually quieting your mind is like, what the fuck?
Mm-hmm.
But like,
why do we have to invite judgment to any of this conversation? But like, that's the auto response.
Right. And that's what people say to me all the time. It's that same thing of like, oh, well, I'm not going to go to yoga because I'm not flexible. And it's like, no, that's exactly why, like, that is one of the reasons that it would be great for you to go to yoga.
I need to do a few privates before I go to yoga.
Yeah. But like the thing for me, like the meditation analogy is like, what you're cultivating in any meditation practice is actually like the space in which you get to observe yourself. And the more you get to cultivate that space in which you observe yourself, the easier it is to approach yourself with grace and compassion and a tone of voice that is just as nurturing as you would approach your loved ones.
Okay, big question before we move to the book club. I think about this too much, I think, but observer mode versus disassociating.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that I'm like, can you ever be too much of an observer where you're disassociated from your present reality?
Totally.
And is that a form of psychosis? Big question for the last question. And we can even like table that for another time.
No,
but that's something that's been on my mind over the past few months.
Is that coming up for you right now, Linda?
No, it's real. When you said the observer, I'm like, you're the person to ask.
Yeah, well, so an example comes up for me where for a couple years ago, I was teaching a yoga for chronic pain management class. And people who have chronic pain statistically have much higher incidence of both acute and complex trauma. And that class was primarily designed around a restorative yoga practice with a lot of focus on breathing and keeping attention in the breath to help people like cultivate a relaxation response. And I remember there was this one woman at the end of her first class who came up to me at the end and said, I like what you're saying about the breath, and a lot of the positions we're doing feel comfortable, but my version of meditation is, I can't remember exactly how she phrased it, but it was exactly that. It was to completely disassociate. She was like, I just completely leave my body. I don't know where I go. And then when you start instructing us into the next posture, I come back. And I said, well, how's that working for you? And she said, in the moment, it's great. I said, okay, so this class is about pain. Are we seeing your pain improve? And she said that to me at the end of her first class. I was like, this is just how we're going to frame this, is like, let's observe how it works in terms of like, is your pain changing? And her pain didn't change for the first 3 classes. I said, okay, so can you start to maybe stay with me when I'm guiding you through body scans and breath work? And after 2 classes of her actually staying focused on the instruction and the sound of my voice and staying in the present moment, observing sensation, she had a total 180 in her fibromyalgia symptoms. So there's something about that wiring of like, a lot of us have learned meditation in a way where we think observing can just be detaching. It's not detaching, it's staying connected and watching what is actually happening.
Well, so in acupuncture, and I like to float regularly, and both of those, I'll completely leave my body. And what you're presenting to me as a question is, can I be in these experiences and be present to what's going on? And I think what's been happening was a coping mechanism, and this will be an interesting experiment.
Yeah, and if those altered states are serving a different purpose, because I know in other forms of plant medicine and shamanism, like those altered states are something to explore unto themselves. But this is where I come back to like, it's up to us to cultivate our relationship with our own intuition, to discern for ourselves, am I using a management technique or am I working on healing?
I think that's really important, because I think to just touch on like the plant medicine as a therapeutic modality, it's only a therapeutic modality if you have tools for integration. And one of the integration tools is having self-awareness, right? And so what we're seeing is a trend in the West of like people going and, combo ceremonies or ayahuasca ceremonies,
Microdosing shrooms in your coffee,
which is awesome. And can be a coping mechanism. Like it can be an intentional experience within a container where it's like, okay, we're going to hold this space and we're going to work through unpacking some of this trauma or whatever. Or it can be just the same thing as me doing 2 lines before a meal as my diet tool, right? It's like,
right. Well,
I think it's a hallucinogen doesn't mean
it can be escapism, or it can be healing, or it can be
conscious exploration for consciousness, being what do they call it? An astronaut? No, that's what's
Ophelia, the conscious astronaut.
We're gonna change your intro. Could it be that simple as the intention though for for either or? Like, could it just be that simple as a different intention?
It totally can be that simple as a
I
different
think we're asking for you to give us permission to go do all the mushrooms.
Yeah, go do all,
Like,
go do all the mushrooms. Tell me how it goes. Well, and there's also, I think part of what I like, coming back to like journaling sprints, is like making sure that we're taking the time to reflect on like, what was my relationship with that thing in the past? And maybe how has that relationship changed?
Mm-hmm.
Because all of these things are about relationship. And for us to be healthy humans in the context in which we find ourselves, what that means is to have adaptability and to have resilience. So like you can change your relationship with something at any point.
As soon as you're aware.
Soon as you're aware. So like cultivating that self-awareness with whatever process you're going through is like really for me that's the heart of maintaining or cultivating, nourishing, nurturing your relationship with your intuition, is like practices that keep you looking at yourself.
So my question, because I know this is the question that's in the minds of our listeners right now, is like, they're like, okay, Irene, I'm sold. Like, I've got a lot of work to do here. I need you to help me breathe, have orgasms, journaling, sprint, meditation. But in all seriousness, this is what you do. You help people work through their trauma and chronic pain, and those are your areas of expertise and specialty. I mean, you did a master's degree in this. You've got the PhD of yoga and also an actual academic master's degree in yoga as a system of healing. So for those who are listening who are like, I know I need to do work around this, how can they get in touch with you? Where can they find you and learn more information about what it looks like to work with you?
Yeah, my website is irenemorning.com. My name and then the time of day. And my social media, my Instagram is Irene_morning. And the best way to get in contact with me is really through either of those.
So you guys need to go give her a follow on Instagram. She also shares a lot of really valuable content on Facebook if you're looking for some free video resources. And if you know that you need to do this work, she does one-on-one healing and has containers for her programs that will actually help you go to the depth that you need to go to work through some of this stuff. So can't recommend her highly enough. You need to go check her out and get yourself some healing, friends. What did I say earlier? Hold on to your boots. Which is not an expression. That's what astronauts say.
With that, will you blast us off to the book club?
Take us to the book club.
Do you have any reading materials that you will recommend to us this week, Irene?
Oh, there's so many that I love for this stuff.
You can go top 2 or 3 if you have to.
I'm going to go top 3 right now. We talked earlier about The Body Keeps the Score, which is kind of like the big book in trauma and understanding how we embody trauma. My other one, kind of along similar lines, is called In an Unspoken Voice. And that's by Peter Levine. And then the one that I'm really obsessed with right now, that's not exactly, well, it relates to everything we've been talking about, is called Pleasure Activism.
I like the name of that one.
Me too.
Yeah,
I want to have a rally of pleasure activists.
That sounds real sexy, and like it also could get really out of hand. Like I just saw like people, maybe that's why people wear those furry outfits. It does seem like, I mean, the
delicious
feels like got way too weird. You're like, that's all the time we have today, folks. So we'll drop those
so much,
guys in the down bar. Yeah, Irene, thank you you just blow me away, man. Every time we talk, I just feel like my mind just exploded.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
It was so fun. You guys go check out Irene. And if you liked this episode, please tag us on Instagram at Rise to Thrive Podcast, share it with a friend, leave us a review on iTunes. We are so grateful to get to spend this time with you guys every week. It just means the world to us that you take us with you on your journey towards growth, manifestation, and wellness. We'll be dropping back in next week. You guys know, Gems Weekly, so you can thrive daily. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us today on another episode of Rise to Thrive podcast. We are so stoked that you're here. If you loved today's episode, if it helped you, please share it with a friend, snap a screenshot, tag us on stories at Rise to Thrive podcast, or head to iTunes or Spotify and leave us an honest review. We love you guys. We appreciate you. And until next time, keep rising, keep thriving. See you next time.